a dog gets one bite free. And if that dog has never shown, or you can't prove any vicious propensities of that dog, and this is the first attack, there's no liability for the owner.
This is the Trials Podcast, where we focus on the challenges the injured face and how we meet and deal with those challenges, especially in litigating catastrophic injury cases. I'm Aaron Gartlan here with friend and trial attorney Forrest Taylor. Forrest, what have you been working on this week? I know you've had a lot going on.
Yeah, it's been a busy week, a busy month, but what we've seen recently is, and we've had a lot of calls regarding dog bite, and some of the cases are fairly tragic. And, we had a really tragic situation in this area where a 16-year-old was mauled and killed by a pack of dogs, presumably pit bulls. But what I wanted to do was talk about a little bit about what someone who's been attacked by a dog, what their options are, what their remedies are, and a little bit about Alabama law.
Well, Forrest, I appreciate that. And if we could, let's kind of break that down into a few segments. I know you've got some experience. We both collectively have experience with past dog bite cases. We've got dog bite cases that are ongoing.
Right.
So if we could, let's maybe start off with an overview of the relevant and specifically Alabama law and dog bite cases, just to give everybody an overview of what you have to prove,
right,
and what makes a dog bite case viable. Okay. And part of that, it'll highlight the challenges that people face in these cases, and then let's follow that up and maybe anchor it down with some cases that you've been involved in.
Well, with any case, with any personal injury case, there are really two broad concepts that we have to look at that have to be present. It's liability and damages. Liability just means there's somebody at fault. Damages means an injury. And so you start off with those two sort of general pillars of any personal injury case. Then with dog bite, there's some real nuances to those general principles. In Alabama, there are two ways that a dog owner could be liable for injuries that their dog caused. The first is a statutory liability. That statutory just means a law that the legislature passed. And that law says if you are bitten on property owned or controlled by the owner, that owner could be liable for the injuries that dog caused. The second concept is what we call common law liability. Common law is what has been established by the courts. And typically common law liability can go back, its origins can go back hundreds of years. But in Alabama, for common law, to be responsible for an injury that your dog caused in Alabama under the common law, the victim has to show that the owner had knowledge that the dog was dangerous. All right. And so how do you prove that owner knew that the dog was dangerous? First of all, Alabama courts have recognized that with certain breeds of dogs, they're just inherently dangerous. And so you don't have to prove that the owner knew that its dog had bitten somebody previously if it falls into one of those breeds. Pit bulls, dogs like that have a reputation for being more dangerous than your normal breed of dog. The other way to prove that the owner knew of the dangerous propensities is just past conduct of the dog. Now, there are cases that say, if a dog barks at the neighbors, growls at the neighbors, chases cars and things like that, that's not sufficient to prove knowledge of the dog owner. So those are sort of the two general principles that we look at when we first, when we're first looking at a dog case, is how are we going to prove liability? And so it's important to know the breed of the dog. If not, then we've got, if the dog does not fall into one of those inherently dangerous breeds, then we've got to show that the owner knew that its dog had this vicious propensity to bite or attack, someone else. And so those are the sort of the two concepts of liability under Alabama law.
Well, Forrest, I appreciate that. And I think it would be helpful to maybe distill this down, because that's really a lot to take in,
Right.
especially for a family if they've suffered some type of catastrophic injury or death related to a dog attack.
Right.
Now, I want to ask you a few follow-up questions and maybe look at this from a little different angle. So you started off talking about a couple of general principles in injury cases and specific to dog bite cases. Well, let's turn that a little bit. I know some of it will be repetitive, but I think it'll be helpful to look at it from a perspective of burden of proof.
Right.
So you talked about a property owner, a dog bite on, and so what I'm getting at is, just because there's a dog attack on someone else's property, it's not an automatic thing. As a plaintiff,
Right.
as the injured party, we've got a burden of proof, or you have a burden to prove these elements, these legal requirements for the case to be able to move forward.
And that's a good point. Yeah.
So those are challenges if somebody is injured, medical bills, out of work, whatever the case may be, those injuries, those damages have to be proven. So could you shed some more light on that? Maybe look at
Right.
a lot of what you just said, but from a little different perspective.
Sure. And one thing you said made me think of something. So when we're talking about statutory liability, the dog attack happens on the owner's property. That's a requirement under the statutory liability. But there are a couple of exceptions. For example, that would not apply to a trespasser, somebody that's trespassing on your property. Also, the dog cannot be provoked. If you're teasing the dog or whatever, even if you're on the property legally, if you provoke the attack, then there's no liability under the statute. So then the other thing that we see, and you touched on this, as I said, damages, your injuries. And by damages, that is a legal term that the law uses to say basically what your compensation should be for your injuries. So when we talk about damages, that's what we mean. Now, a issue that we face in some dog bite cases, they can be exceptionally traumatic. I mean, you can imagine, being attacked by a dog and, you're fearing for your life. Many times the medical bills are relatively low. And an issue that we have is fighting with insurance companies because they point to the fact, look, you don't have that much in medical bills. But what we have to convince the insurance company is that, well, yes, but we've got scarring. We've got now this kid or this person has got a fear of animals. So that's part of our job as attorneys, is to develop a package that convinces the insurance company that this claim is worth more than just, the medicals. Now, we have handled cases where the medical expenses in a dog bite case have been astronomical. And those where we've had skin grafts, necrotic flesh, and even rabies shots, is an extremely expensive proposition for somebody that, has suffered a dog bite case. So I don't know if that answers your question, but those are some of the issues that we deal with when we're developing the case. So we look at liability and then we look at damages. And also, we've had several cases where, a child is attacked in their own yard by a neighbor's dog, and the mother comes out there or the parent comes out there and has to rescue the child. And obviously that is traumatic for the whole family. And it really can affect somebody's quality of life, because now you're afraid to go in your own backyard. And we've had several of those cases. We handled a case several years ago where a woman was in her backyard hanging out clothes to dry, and the neighbor's dog broke off a chain, jumped a fence, and attacked her. And since then, she's been fearful to go in her own backyard. And so those are some of the impacts that a dog attack can have on the victim.
So, Forrest, yeah, I believe we're getting there, but let me reiterate something that you've talked about. So, the dog attack, and then earlier you mentioned vicious breeds, certain vicious breeds, certain dogs that are considered vicious breeds, and we also hear things like the one bite rule.
Right.
So, could you elaborate on, from a proof standpoint, when the call comes in, when a family contacts us, from a liability standpoint, we've got to prove somebody did something wrong.
Right.
Somebody did something wrong. So how does that work in the dog bite cases?
So, so typically the shorthand under common law liability is, a dog gets one bite free. And if that dog has never shown, or you can't prove any vicious propensities of that dog, and this is the first attack, there's no liability for the owner. And that's what's meant by the one bite free rule. And again, sort of the legal jargon is the burden that we have to prove is that owner had knowledge of that dog's vicious propensities. And if the dog had bit somebody in the past, then that owner is on notice that a dog, has that propensity to bite. And so those are, that is one aspect of the burden of proof. And the other aspect on the burden of proof is proving our damages, and that takes several forms. We've got medical bills that we have to prove, medical treatment that we have to prove, and probably, some of the harder things in dog bite cases that we don't deal with, let's say, an orthopedic injury. And again, I touched on it earlier, is just the emotional impact of being attacked by the dog, because in our experience, it is a very traumatic emotional experience for the victim. And sometimes communicating that to an insurance company or a jury is difficult, because it's not something that people normally like to talk about and relive. And sometimes we have to get counselors involved, or have the our client evaluated by a psychologist that then can testify on behalf of our client. But again, that's again, when you're talking about burden of proof, again, we go back to the two pillars of any case is liability and damages, and those are some of the aspects of the burden of proof that we have in a dog bite case.
And again, just to be clear, if it is one of those vicious breeds, then the component of the one bite or the notice of the vicious propensities, if it is the vicious breed,
Right.
that would cover that part of the burden of proof.
That's right. So if it is one of those dogs that fall in that vicious breed category, then the dog does not get the one bite free, because the owner is presumed to be on notice. Look, you've got this inherently dangerous animal, and we're not going to give you the benefit of the one bite rule. So yes, and let me just bring up another point. In a case that we handled, we hired a dog expert, a dog trainer, and to come in and testify about the different breeds of dogs, and how this certain breed was inherently dangerous. So sometimes you can find answers in the case law, prior cases where a court has held like a pit bull is inherently dangerous. But if you're dealing with some other breeds, you may have to call an expert to establish, yes, this is a recognized breed that is inherently dangerous.
Forrest, I'm glad you brought that up, because, from my perspective, this demonstrates clearly the challenges an individual or family would face in the aftermath of a vicious dog attack.
Right.
Catastrophic injuries and everything that goes along with that. And you've touched on, briefly about some of the cases that you've handled, but specifically through your experience, what challenges, again, we see it, it's what we deal with day in and day out. But for people that haven't been through this experience and are going through it now, what are some of the pitfalls and challenges that you've seen over the years?
Well, I think some of the challenges, there's a practical challenge. Many times, if you own a home, most likely you've got homeowners insurance. And your homeowners insurance in general would cover, if you owned a dog and that dog attacked somebody, your homeowners would insure that, okay? Would cover that loss. And that's who we would normally deal with. And insurance companies work at trying to get out of paying claims. And what I would encourage people, and I'm a dog owner. I've always been a dog owner since I was a kid. I grew up with dogs. I've got dogs now, and I have always owned dogs. But I would encourage, if you are a dog owner, and a homeowner, you need to look at your insurance policy, because you want to make sure that you're covered for that risk. And what we've seen in the last 5 years or so is that these insurance companies, buried in the fine print, will say, yeah, we cover, and it's not quite this clear, but yeah, we will cover, if you've got a dog and it bites somebody, we'll cover that, but in the fine print, except, for these certain breeds. And people think, the homeowners think, look, I'm covered, and then it turns out the dog that they picked is excluded from coverage. So, that's one thing that, if you're a homeowner and a dog owner, that's something to look at. But going back to the person that has been attacked by a dog, again, it sort of the third leg that I didn't mention is that you've got to have somewhere some ability to recover those damages, those money damages. And typically that's with the insurance company. And a lot of times we see people who have no homeowners insurance, or the dog is excluded. And getting compensation in those cases can be a challenge. But if somebody has suffered a dog attack, I think it's important, one is to file a police report, because that will trigger an investigation by typically the police, code enforcement, animal control. And the good thing about that is they're there almost the day it happens if you file that police report, and they collect a lot of information, And in some of the cases that we've handled, our clients have not called us until months after the incident. And so if if there's been a police report or an investigation, that information and that investigation has been very helpful in developing our case, because a lot of times the code enforcement officer or police will do interviews, find witnesses, and that can be extremely helpful. The other thing that I would encourage people to do is take pictures. If you've been injured, have a dog bite, because a picture speaks 1,000 words. And seeing, we've got a lot of examples of just really bad injuries from dog bites, and looking at these photographs, taken days or weeks after it happened, is very persuasive to a jury, because that helps us communicate how bad this person was injured. And again, that's one thing that I would do. And obviously, this is not legal advice, but the big thing is, and one concern I would have is just, does that dog have its rabies shots? And that's why you would need to seek medical treatment and file a police report, because that's always a concern. And unfortunately, we have had many cases where the dog had not had its rabies shots. And so what that does is create a great deal of uncertainty on the victim, and they have to go through the rabies treatment then. And we even had a case that we handled years ago, that the dog had been vaccinated for rabies, but had rabies. And so, again, that adds to the emotional stress of, does this, is this dog, have been exposed to rabies? And so I would encourage, you ask, what are some things that people should do? I mean, one, get medical attention, and, contact law enforcement. And that's very important to do. The other thing is, sometimes in some of the counties in Alabama, if you're out in the county, there may not be, a code enforcement officer or somebody like that. So, but I would encourage, those two things.
Well, enforced, I'm really enjoying this conversation, and I think we're kind of getting there in addressing and talking about the challenges involved in these cases. But I did want to reiterate a few more things. So one of the things that we're often dealing with is just Alabama law is not always favorable. In fact,
Right.
oftentimes it's not written for, and I would even go so far as to say most of the time it's not written for the injured.
Right.
So Alabama law builds in some protections for property owners.
Right.
One of the things that, as you know, we've seen in dog bite cases is a scenario where it's rental property, and it can often be
Good
challenging
point.
to identify the dog owner,
Very good
and
point.
the
Right.
property owner has an additional level of protection.
Right.
And part of what I'm getting to here is something else that you touched on, the investigation. Certain municipalities out in the county, there may or may not be the same ordinances in place, and all investigations aren't necessarily done the same. I know we've had cases where we're doing an independent
Right.
investigation, and so often, and I promise I'm getting to the questions here, but I believe all this ties together. So often, you pointed out, it may be weeks and months later that a family contacts us, an individual contacts us, whether it could be because they're going through extensive medical treatment and just not able to contact us sooner. It could be because they're corresponding with the insurance company.
right.
They're corresponding with law enforcement and the investigation. But at some point, they get frustrated with it, and contact us. So again, I think that highlights some of the challenges. But if you could just elaborate on what I've touched on
Yeah,
there.
so I think you bring up two important points. And we have dealt with this situation frequently where you have a tenant with a dog, and that dog bites somebody. Typically, that tenant has no insurance. The question is, can you hold the landlord responsible? And in most instances, you cannot. That landlord may have insurance, but under Alabama law, the burden of proof to hold that landlord responsible for a dog attack that was owned by one of the landlord's tenants is very difficult. And so that is a challenge, and we do see that frequently. And the landlord just says, "Well, I'm not responsible." And a lot of times, it is a huge challenge on doing that. Now, the other thing that we've seen, and one reason why people wait to contact us, is many times they're in touch with the homeowner's insurance, and they get these letters from them, and they think that they're getting taken care of. Then months later, they get the letter saying, "Look, we're denying liability." And this is after, the first letter says, "We're sorry this happened, send us your medical bills." And the victim thinks, "Well, I'm going to be taken care of." And eventually, again, a lot of times we've seen this, is that the victim will get a letter saying, "We're not responsible." And so I think that is one reason that we see the delay in people maybe contacting an attorney. The other thing is, many times this involves neighbors. And, the last thing, a lot of people want to do is, cause a ruckus with their neighbors. And so those are some of the issues that I think a victim has to deal with.
And in our experience, these are cases that a high percentage of them are going to go into litigation.
Right.
Oftentimes.
Right.
Now, it may settle somewhere along the way, but wouldn't you say these are cases that more often are going to, in order to get anywhere, we're going to have to file a lawsuit?
That's right, because many times to get the information that we need, we may have to subpoena somebody, we may have to take the dog owner's deposition, and you can only do that after filing a lawsuit. Those are legal tools that we can use to get information. And, and a lot of times, when we do file a lawsuit, we get that smoking gun that establishes liability. And so, yes, so a lot of these cases do wind up in litigation. And I'm not saying that they ultimately go to a jury trial, because many times they get settled in litigation. And again, one side may get a smoking gun, and, it encourages the other side to settle. But yes, a lot of these cases go into litigation. And the other thing that we find is that many of our clients, or many of the victims, are children, and which makes it, more challenging, because, a lot of times children just aren't good at vocalizing what they're going through. But, unfortunately, a lot of victims of dog bites are kids.
And Force, you bring up some really good points, and it reminds me of one of the trial lawyers that we both have had the opportunity to work with over the years, Randy Smith.
Right.
Randy used to say, "Aaron, we don't win our case at trial, we win it during trial preparation."
Exactly.
And I guess the point that I want to make with that is the sooner that can start, the better.
Right.
So we would highly recommend someone, if you or a family member has unfortunately experienced some type of dog attack, oftentimes a 15-minute conversation, we can discuss the
Right.
legal options. Now, that doesn't always mean in 15 minutes we're going to know, we're going to
Right.
have all the information we need to make the best decisions. But oftentimes in a 15 to 30-minute telephone conversation, it's we're really easy to connect with, to talk to, and we can at least give an assessment of the legal options
Right.
in a relatively short telephone
Right.
conversation.
And as always with personal injury claims, if you call us, our there's no charge for a consultation. And we're always happy, we can either do it by phone or, we're always happy to meet with people. We can meet with them in our office or, if it's inconvenient to come to our office, we can go to them too. So, but yes, I mean, a lot of times we're able to provide a lot of information in just a short period of time. And then, a client, may be uncertain whether they want to follow through with it, but at least if they call us, we can equip them with the information to make an informed decision. So, yes, so I would encourage, if you've been, if you've had, like you said, the unfortunate circumstance of being bit by a dog or attacked by a dog, give us a call and we can evaluate your case. And again, no charge for that.
Well, Forrest, listen, I appreciate everything you do for us, for our clients. I know we've covered a lot of ground here today, but do you think that we've left anything out as we get to the end here?
I don't think so. I think we've covered most aspects of dog owner liability, and again, it can be a very challenging area of the law just due to the nature of the proving liability and sometimes the damages aspect of it. But I think we've covered it all, and I think you've pointed out several things that our clients need to consider.
Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Trials Podcast, where we focus on the challenges the injured face. Forrest, I know we've covered a lot of ground here today, and I appreciate you being here with us. As we close, what are the takeaways that you have?
Well, I think the takeaway or takeaways would be, if you've been a victim of a dog attack or a family member's been a victim of a dog attack, as I mentioned, one, get medical treatment. And again, that's not legal advice, it's just common sense. I would definitely contact law enforcement because, again, you don't know the history of that dog. You don't know if that dog's been vaccinated. So contact law enforcement. Then I think it's always good to seek legal advice in those situations. Again, many times attorneys in personal injury cases, we will do this. We'll talk with you, do a consultation for no charge. And that way you're equipped with the legal knowledge to decide whether or not you want to pursue this claim. One last thing, again, is just documentation of evidence, take pictures, and I think those are the important takeaways that I would have for someone who has been unfortunately attacked or bitten by a dog.